A terminally ill 6-year-old boy, with only one day left to live, used his final wish not to go to Disneyland or meet a superhero, but to hand Johnny Carson a letter that would destroy him on live television. The doctors said Danny Mitchell had hours, maybe a day at most, and he'd chosen to spend it telling Johnny Carson a truth no one was ready to hear. What was written on that piece of paper wasn't a thank you, wasn't a request, wasn't even a goodbye. It was a confession that would change everything Johnny thought he knew about courage. Because this 6-year-old boy wasn't asking for hope, he was asking for permission to give up. Johnny Carson was in the middle of interviewing Robert Blake when a production assistant did something that had never happened in 19 years of The Tonight Show. She walked onto the stage during a live taping, leaned down, and whispered something in his ear that made him go completely still. In the hallway, just beyond Studio One, a mother had crumpled against the wall, not from grief, not from exhaustion, but from something her young son had just whispered to her, something that made her legs give out. "I'm ready now." November 2nd, 1979, Burbank, California. Everything was running like clockwork on The Tonight Show. Johnny was mid-interview with Robert Blake. The audience was laughing. Ed McMahon was grinning at his desk. Then Janet Morrison did something that had never happened in 19 years of production. She walked onto the stage during a live taping. She knew the rules. You never interrupt. Never. But there she was, heading straight for Johnny with an expression that made the entire studio go silent. The crew knew immediately. Johnny excused himself from Robert Blake. The audience thought it was a bit. Janet leaned close and whispered the situation. A boy backstage. Make-A-Wish Foundation. Hours left, maybe a day. His mother had collapsed in the hallway after the boy whispered something to her. She was physically okay, but she couldn't stop crying. Johnny's face changed. What did he say? Janet's voice cracked. "I'm ready now." Just those words. And she went down like someone cut her strings. For a moment, Johnny didn't move. 20 million people were watching. Robert Blake was waiting. But none of that mattered anymore. Johnny asked the boy's age. 6 years old, Danny Mitchell. Bring him out. Now. Janet hesitated, mentioning the shaken mother, but Johnny was already standing. Bring them both out. He turned to the audience. His voice was steady, but his eyes told a different story. Folks, we're going to do something a little different right now. We have a very special young man backstage who came all the way here tonight just to say hello. What Johnny Carson didn't know as he walked toward that stage entrance was that those words would haunt him for the rest of his days. Danny Mitchell was 6 years old, weighed 38 pounds, and had never cried once during his entire battle with brain cancer. His mother, Sarah, had watched her baby endure things that would break grown men, and he'd faced every moment with a smile. The nurses at Children's Hospital Los Angeles called him the bravest boy in the city. But Sarah wasn't sobbing in that hallway because her son was brave. She was crying because Danny had finally told her the truth. And the truth was devastating. Danny's story started like too many others, a headache that wouldn't go away. Then the CAT scan showed everything a tumor the size of a golf ball pressing against parts of his brain no 6-year-old should have to think about. The oncologist used words like aggressive and inoperable and limited time. Danny's father left 3 months later. Couldn't handle it. And he fought. Smiled through procedures that made seasoned nurses look away, told jokes to doctors, colored pictures that said, "Get well soon, Mama," even though Sarah wasn't the sick one. Danny had become the strong one, the one taking care of everyone else's feelings while his body betrayed him. But every night at 11:30, they had a ritual. Sarah would wheel the television into Danny's room, and they'd watch The Tonight Show together. Danny couldn't always laugh. Sometimes the pain was too much. But Johnny Carson made Sarah laugh. And when Sarah laughed, Danny felt something close to peace. Johnny became Danny's safe place. Not the hospital. Not even his mother's arms. Those 60 minutes when a man on television made the world feel normal again. 6 weeks earlier, Danny had whispered something to his mother in the darkness. Something about going. Something about meeting the man who made her smile. Sarah tried to explain that people like Johnny Carson don't meet regular people. But she'd called the Make-A-Wish Foundation anyway. Voice shaking. Hope, barely alive. Then the call came. November 1st, 1 slot, Tomorrow night in Burbank. Could they make it? Sarah said yes before the woman finished asking. Now they are here. Danny in his wheelchair just off stage. Sarah crumpled in the hallway. And those words Danny had whispered were about to reach Johnny Carson's ears. What do you pack when you know it's your child's last trip anywhere? The doctors told Sarah that Danny had one more good day left. After that, the tumor would take his vision, then his speech, then everything that made Danny himself. 3 nights earlier, Danny had asked the night nurse, Patricia, to help him with something secret. She'd found him awake at 2 in the morning, whispering through tears he thought no one could see. 3 nights earlier, Danny had asked the night nurse, Patricia, to help him with something secret. She'd found him at 2 in the morning, crying through tears he thought no one could see. His hands shook too much to write. He needed to tell Mr. Carson the truth before he forgot the words. Patricia pulled up a chair, pen ready. Danny dictated slowly, like each word cost him something. An apology for being brave when he should have been honest. His confession of what he'd hidden for 2 years. That he was so tired. So tired. Patricia helped him fold the letter into quarters. Danny clutched it like it was the most precious thing in the world. Now, that letter was tucked in the pocket of his navy blue suit, 3 sizes too big because Sarah couldn't afford another before the end came. Danny had straightened his clip-on tie that morning with such fierce dignity that Sarah had to turn away before he saw her crying. The drive from Los Angeles to Burbank took 45 minutes. Danny watched out the window the entire time, drinking in the palm trees and ordinary people living ordinary lives. He hadn't been outside in 3 weeks. Sarah caught him staring at a dog walking on a sidewalk with such intensity, such longing, that she'd had to pull over to collect herself. When they arrived at NBC Studios, the production staff was waiting. Everyone understood they were witnessing something sacred and terrible. Johnny had been briefed. There's a kid tonight, Johnny. 6 years old. Brain tumor. Hours left. Maybe a day. Should take 5 minutes. Tops. Johnny nodded, made a mental note to be extra kind. He'd met sick children before. 5 minutes. Maybe 10. But when Janet Morrison wheeled Danny through the backstage area, something felt different. Danny wasn't crying. He was clutching that letter and looking at the studio with eyes that had seen far too much. The production assistant said later that Danny looked like a man walking toward destiny. And in the hallway, just before they brought Danny out, he'd leaned close to his mother. Sarah's knees buckled. The stage door was opening. Danny Mitchell was about to change Johnny Carson's life forever. If this story is already touching your heart, hit that subscribe button. What happens next will stay with you forever. And we have more untold stories about the human moments that made Johnny Carson a legend. The stage door opened and Johnny saw him for the first time. A boy in a navy blue suit that swallowed him whole, bald from chemotherapy, with eyes that looked ancient and young all at once. When Danny looked up at Johnny and smiled that brave smile he'd been wearing like armor for 2 years, something in Johnny's chest went tight. He didn't know yet that in less than 10 minutes, this boy would shatter him completely. The audience didn't know how to react. This wasn't a celebrity. This was a child in a wheelchair. Some applauded uncertainly. Others sat in confused silence. But then they saw Johnny's face the way he immediately walked away from his desk, leaving Robert Blake alone. The way he moved toward that wheelchair without hesitation. And they understood something important was happening. Johnny knelt beside the wheelchair, got down on one knee, eye level with the boy, and asked his name. Danny Mitchell, sir. I'm 6 years old. I came all the way from Los Angeles. Johnny smiled at the mention of the neighboring city and asked about traffic. And Danny giggled. Actually giggled. The audience melted. 20 million people watching at home felt it too. Johnny gestured to Sarah, standing off stage, one hand covering her mouth. That's my mama. Danny's face lit up with something that looked like pride. She watches you with me every single night, Mr. Carson. We never miss a show. Not ever. Johnny's throat tightened. This wasn't just a meet and greet. This boy had been watching him for years, counting on him, finding something in those 60 minutes that the hospital couldn't give. Ed McMahon's face showed pure tenderness, mixed with heartbreak. Doc Severinsen had put down his trumpet. Camera operators were blinking back tears. Everyone understood they were watching something real unfold. Something true. Johnny noticed Danny's hand resting on something in his jacket pocket. The boy kept touching it, protecting it. "You got something there, pal?" Danny nodded, suddenly serious. The playful moment was over. He'd made something for Johnny. But first he needed to ask if Johnny made people happy when they were sad. Watching him helped people feel better. Johnny felt something shift in the room as he confirmed it. "Yeah, he tried his best. That's why I needed to meet you." Danny's voice was quiet but steady. "Because there's something I need to tell somebody who understands what it means to make people feel safe." The audience held its breath. Johnny knew whatever came next would change everything. Then the question left his mouth before he could stop it. "So what do you want to be when you grow up, Danny?" The silence was excruciating. Everyone in that studio knew the answer. Danny Mitchell wasn't going to grow up. But Danny didn't flinch. He looked at Johnny with those ancient eyes and told him to be just like him, to make people happy when they're sad, to be the person they look forward to seeing every night. Johnny's face did something complicated, pain and pride and heartbreak all at once. Ed McMahon had his hand over his mouth. Sarah was gripping the curtain off stage, knuckles white. "Not someday," they all heard. "But in time I have left." Danny reached into his jacket pocket with trembling hands and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the edges worn from being touched over and over. The thing he'd been protecting this whole time. He'd written it down because he was afraid he couldn't say it out loud. A nurse had helped with the spelling. Johnny took the paper. The cameras zoomed in. 20 million Americans leaned toward their screens. The studio had gone so quiet you could hear the stage lights humming. "You should read it, Mr. Carson." Danny's voice was barely a whisper. "Because if I try to say it, I won't be brave anymore." He paused, looked down, then back up, with eyes that had seen too much. "And I've been brave for so long." The exhaustion in those words made Johnny's hands shake harder as he began to unfold the paper. What he was about to read would break him in ways he didn't know a person could break. The exhaustion in those words, the weight of 2 years of forced courage pressing down on a 6-year-old boy, made Johnny's hands shake harder as he began to unfold the paper. What he was about to read would break him in ways he didn't know a person could break. Johnny unfolded the letter slowly, hands trembling. He began to read silently, eyes moving across the shaky handwriting. The studio audience watched his face change, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched that legendary Carson control crack with each line. He got halfway through and had to stop, had to close his eyes and breathe. Then he looked up at Danny with such profound heartbreak that 20 million people felt it through their screens. Danny was watching carefully, waiting. And then, in a voice so quiet the microphones barely picked it up, Danny said the words that would define this moment forever. "I'm ready now, Mr. Carson." Johnny stared at this impossibly brave, impossibly exhausted boy, and something inside the king of late-night television completely shattered. His face crumpled, his shoulders shook. He tried to speak, and no sound came except a choked sob that echoed through that silent studio. The letter fell from his hands. Danny reached out and placed his hand gently on Johnny's arm. "It's okay to cry, Mr. Carson. Mama cries too. It doesn't mean you're not brave. It just means you have a big heart." That demolished whatever composure Johnny had left. He pulled Danny into his arms so careful because the boy was fragile, and Johnny Carson sobbed. Not pretty tears, not television tears. The gut-wrenching, soul-deep crying that comes from a place you can't control. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay silent. Most were crying too. Ed McMahon had tears streaming down his face. Doc Severinsen had turned away, hand over his eyes. Camera operators kept filming, but their cameras shook. 20 million Americans watched a man have his heart broken on live television. Johnny finally pulled back, still holding Danny's shoulders, face wet with tears. He picked up the letter with shaking hands, and this time, he read it aloud, voice breaking with every word. "Dear Mr. Carson, I have been very brave for Mama. I smiled when it hurt really bad. I never cried because I didn't want her to be more sad than she already is. But I'm so tired now, Mr. Carson. I'm so tired. And I'm ready now. I'm ready to stop being brave. I'm ready to stop pretending I'm okay when I'm not okay. I wanted to tell you first because when I watch you on TV, I feel safe. Like maybe it's okay to be tired. Like maybe it's okay to say when something is too hard. Can you help Mama understand that I'm not giving up? I'm just tired of hurting. I love you, Mr. Carson. Thank you for making Mama smile when I couldn't anymore. Your friend, Danny. Johnny looked at this boy who just trusted him with the hardest truth a human being can speak. The studio audience sat in absolute silence. No one moved. No one coughed. Some had their hands over their mouths. Others were holding on to the person next to them. A woman in the third row was silently sobbing into her husband's shoulder. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was 300 strangers witnessing something sacred. A moment so raw and real that it transcended television entirely. And he understood that Danny hadn't come here to be cheered up or distracted or given false hope. He'd come to be given permission to be human. But here's what Johnny didn't know yet. In giving Danny permission to be tired, he was about to receive permission to be human himself. Sometimes the person you're trying to save is actually saving you. Take a moment if you need to. We know this hit hard. Drop a comment below about how this story made you feel, or share a memory of someone who showed this kind of courage. Sometimes we need to cry together for 10 seconds. Nobody in that studio breathed. The show cut to commercial, but what happened next would never be broadcast. Because the moment those lights went on, Johnny Carson gave himself permission to completely break down. The gut-wrenching, body-shaking sobs of a man who'd just been told a truth too heavy to carry alone. Ed McMahon stood up from his desk. He walked over slowly, placed his hand on Johnny's shoulder, and said nothing. Just stood there. Solid, present. Doc Severinsen caught his eye and gestured to the band. Stay quiet. Stay still. This is sacred. The entire studio staff stood perfectly still and bore witness to something holy. Johnny finally found his voice. It came out rough, broken. Danny's chin trembled. He told Johnny that Mama needed him to be brave, that she needed him to be okay so she wouldn't feel so sad. Johnny shook his head, tears still streaming. He told Danny the truth his mother had been too afraid to say, that what she really needed was honesty, that being tired doesn't mean giving up. It means being human, and being human means sometimes things are too hard. That's not weakness. Something in Danny's face cracked. That brave smile he'd been wearing like a mask for 2 years finally slipped. His body started to shake. And for the first time since his diagnosis, Danny Mitchell cried. Not from physical pain. From relief? Pure, overwhelming relief that he didn't have to pretend anymore. Johnny pulled Danny into his arms and just held him while the boy sobbed. Sarah saw this from off stage and couldn't stay away. She ran to her son, dropped to her knees, and wrapped her arms around both of them. The three of them stayed there on that famous Tonight Show stage, releasing 2 years of grief and fear locked up inside a boy who thought he had to be strong. After a few minutes, Danny's sobs quieted. He pulled back, wiping his eyes with the too long sleeve of his suit jacket. Then, something unexpected happened. Danny looked up at Johnny and his mouth twitched into a small, real smile. Not the brave one, a genuine one. He asked if Johnny wanted to hear a joke. Johnny smiled through his tears and said he'd love to. Why did the chicken go to the playground? To get to the other slide. It wasn't funny. It was a kid joke that barely made sense. But Johnny laughed. Really laughed. That deep, genuine laugh that had made him America's favorite for 19 years. And Danny lit up like the sun coming out after a storm. For the first time since they'd met, Danny looked like a regular 6-year-old kid. Not brave, not strong, not putting on a show for anyone. Just a boy who told a silly joke and got his hero to laugh. Sarah watched from off stage and realized something. For 2 years, she'd been trying to give Danny hope. But what he'd needed wasn't hope. It was permission to be a kid one more time. The moment broke something open between them. Made it real. Johnny leaned close, and made Danny a promise. That he was here. However, Danny needed him. For however long Danny needed him. That Danny wasn't alone in this anymore. Danny nodded, hiccuping through his tears, and said something that would echo in Johnny Carson's mind for the rest of his life. "Thank you for letting me be tired, Mr. Carson. Thank you for saying it's okay." And at that moment, Johnny understood that Danny hadn't come to meet a celebrity. He'd come to find the one person who would give him permission to be human. Danny Mitchell passed away 13 days later, on November 15th, 1979, in his mother's arms at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. But those 13 days weren't filled with suffering. They were filled with something Danny had never allowed himself before: honesty. He didn't have to smile when it hurt. He didn't have to pretend he wasn't scared. He didn't have to be brave for anyone. And every single one of those 13 days, Johnny Carson was there. Johnny canceled everything. 3 tapings of The Tonight Show, interviews with Time magazine and Rolling Stone, a charity event in Las Vegas. He'd moved his entire world to center around a hospital room where a 6-year-old boy was living his last days with brutal honesty. Because Danny had trusted Johnny with the hardest truth anyone can speak, and Johnny honored that trust by not leaving him alone. Johnny showed up every morning at 9 o'clock. He'd bring coffee for Sarah, orange juice for Danny, even though the boy could barely drink it anymore. They'd talk, sometimes about funny things, sometimes about scary things. Sometimes Danny would cry and tell Johnny how much it hurt, how tired he was, how he just wanted it to be over. And Johnny would hold his hand and say, "I know, buddy, I know. It's okay to feel that way. You're allowed to be tired." Other times, when Danny had energy, Johnny would do his monologue right there in that hospital room. He'd stand at the foot of the bed and perform like he was on stage. But his audience was one boy who could barely keep his eyes open. The nurses would gather in the doorway to watch. Other patients' families would peek in, and Johnny would make them all laugh, give them 10 minutes of forgetting where they were. On day 7, Danny was having a particularly hard afternoon. The pain was worse. The medication made everything foggy. Johnny asked him gently where he'd want to be right now if he could be anywhere. Danny's eyes were closed, but he answered, "The beach." He'd never seen the ocean. Mama always said they'd go someday, but there was never enough money. Johnny was quiet for a moment. Then, he told Danny to close his eyes and keep them closed. And for the next 3 minutes, Johnny painted the ocean with words. "Close your eyes, Danny. Can you hear it? The waves rolling in, one after another, like the world's slowest heartbeat. Whoosh, crash. Whoosh, crash. Each wave bringing thousands of tiny bubbles that pop and fizz on the sand. Now the smell. That salt air smell that gets in your hair and on your skin and makes everything taste a little bit like adventure. It's ocean and seaweed and sun-warmed wood from the boardwalk. Feel the sand between your toes. It's warm on top from the sun. But when you dig down a few inches, it's cool and damp. And if you walk to where the waves are breaking, the sand is hard and smooth under your feet, and the water is cold, so cold it makes you gasp, but in a good way. The sun sparkles on the water like diamonds scattered across blue silk. And if you're really quiet, you can hear the seagulls calling to each other overhead, and somewhere in the distance, kids are laughing as they jump over waves. Danny smiled with his eyes closed. His breathing slowed. For those 3 minutes, he wasn't in a hospital room. He was at the beach. Sarah watched this unfold from the corner of the room. This legend, this person who had no obligation to them, showing up every single day, feeding Danny ice chips when his throat was too sore to swallow, reading books when the boy's vision started to fade, sitting in silence when there were no words left, just his hand resting on Danny's shoulder, letting him know he wasn't alone. By the 11th day, Danny was barely conscious. The tumor was taking everything now. But Johnny came anyway. He sat beside that bed for 8 hours straight, filling the room with his voice. Stories about Nebraska, his first time on television, mistakes he'd made and lucky breaks he'd gotten. Everything and nothing. Just so Danny would know someone was there. Sarah tried to thank him once. Tried to find words big enough for what Johnny was giving them. But Johnny stopped her, told her quietly that Danny had given him something he didn't even know he needed, that Danny had reminded him what matters. I should be thanking him. And Sarah realized something that would stay with her forever. Johnny wasn't doing this out of pity or obligation or even kindness. He was doing it because Danny had changed him. And Johnny was honoring that gift the only way he knew how. On the 13th day, November 15th, Danny opened his eyes one last time. Sarah was on one side of the bed. Johnny was on the other, right where he'd been every single day. Danny looked at his mother with love that transcended words. Then he turned to Johnny. His lips moved, barely a whisper. He was trying to say something, his voice so faint, Sarah had to lean close to hear. Tell Mr. Carson thank you for letting me be tired. Those were Danny's last words. And then, peacefully, with his mother holding one hand and Johnny holding the other, Danny Mitchell slipped away. The boy who'd been brave for 2 years finally got to rest. And Johnny Carson understood that he'd just witnessed the most profound act of courage he'd ever seen. Danny hadn't just passed on. He taught everyone around him that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit when you can't fight anymore. 3 o'clock in the morning. Sarah Mitchell sat at her kitchen table, pen trembling over blank paper. She'd been trying for 2 hours to find words big enough. Finally, she just wrote, Dear Johnny, the informality of using his first name felt right. They weren't celebrity and fan anymore. They were two people bound together by love for a boy who'd taught them both what mattered. Sarah told him Danny had left peacefully in her arms yesterday morning, that Johnny was the last person he spoke about, that his final words were, Tell Mr. Carson thank you for letting me be tired. Her hand shook as she wrote the truth she'd been too afraid to face, that Johnny had given Danny something she couldn't permission to stop pretending. The handwriting got messier as emotion overwhelmed her. For 2 years, she'd watched her baby boy carry a weight no child should carry, the weight of her grief, her fear, her desperation. He'd smiled when he was in agony, told jokes when he could barely breathe. 6 years old, and taking care of her, instead of the other way around. I failed him, she wrote. The words burned, but they were true. She'd asked him to be brave when she should have told him it was okay to be scared. But Johnny had done what she couldn't. He told Danny that exhaustion isn't surrender. That honesty isn't weakness. That being human is enough. Sarah's hand cramped, but she kept writing. Johnny had sat with her son for 13 days, held his hand while he passed from this world, given him dignity and the freedom to finally be real. I will never be able to repay you for that. Never, in 100 lifetimes. She finished as the sun began to rise. Thanked him for seeing Danny not as a tragedy or a charity case, but as himself. A boy who loved to laugh and hated pretending, and just needed someone to say it was okay to stop fighting. You were that person for him. Forever grateful, Sarah. Johnny kept that letter in his desk drawer for the rest of his life, right next to the letter Danny had given him on that Tonight Show stage. When Johnny passed away in 2005, 26 years later, those 2 letters were found together, paper-clipped, with a note in Johnny's handwriting. The day I learned what courage really means. Johnny never spoke publicly about Danny. When reporters asked about emotional moments on the show, he'd deflect with a joke or change the subject entirely. But people close to him noticed something had shifted. Ed McMahon said it best. After Danny, Johnny stopped performing life and started living it. The most important moments, Johnny had learned, aren't the ones on camera, but there was something else. Something Sarah wouldn't discover for years. 3 months after Danny passed, Sarah's landlord knocked on her door with a strange look on his face. Someone had paid her rent for the entire year. In cash. He wouldn't say who. Sarah thought it was a mistake. Then the hospital called. Danny's medical bills, $247,000 worth of bills that Sarah would have spent the rest of her life paying off, had been cleared. Paid in full. Anonymous donor. That's when Sarah knew. There was no mistake. A week later, a lawyer showed up at her door with paperwork for a trust fund, established in her name. Enough money that she'd never work double shifts again, never choose between groceries and electricity. The lawyer wouldn't say who set it up. Only that the donor had one condition. Sarah could never tell anyone where the money came from. But Sarah didn't need to be told who it was. There was only one person who'd loved Danny enough to make sure his mother never suffered another day. Johnny Carson had taken care of everything without fanfare or recognition, because that's what you do when someone teaches you what matters. What Sarah didn't discover until after Johnny passed away in 2005 was that he'd done even more. Much more. Johnny had started a private foundation for pediatric cancer research. Millions of dollars directed toward better treatments, gentler protocols, ways to help children fight without having to be so impossibly brave. The foundation funded 17 research projects over 26 years. Not a single person knew Johnny was behind it until his estate was settled. For 26 years, Johnny Carson had been honoring a 6-year-old boy's memory in complete silence. No press releases, no galas, no recognition. Just quiet action that helped thousands of children Sarah would never meet. Danny had taught Johnny what courage really meant, and Johnny had spent the rest of his life proving he'd learned the lesson. On Johnny's final episode of The Tonight Show in May 1992, someone in the audience held up a sign. Just 3 words. Remember Danny Mitchell. The cameras caught Johnny's face when he saw it. Everything else in that studio fell away. The band stopped playing mid-note. Ed McMahon followed Johnny's gaze, and his own eyes went wet. Johnny stopped mid-sentence. His hand went to his chest, right over his heart, and stayed there. He nodded once, slowly. His lips moved, just barely forming words only he could hear. I remember, buddy. Every day. And for just a second, that legendary Carson composure cracked. Not in sadness. In gratitude. After the show, a reporter who'd been covering Johnny for 20 years asked what the sign meant. Who was Danny Mitchell? Johnny looked at that reporter with an expression that was part sadness, part pride, part something that looked like peace. The bravest person I ever met, Johnny said quietly. And he was 6 years old. The reporter waited for more. But Johnny just smiled, that genuine smile, the one that wasn't for cameras, and walked away. Some stories, he'd learned, are too important to perform. Here's what people don't understand about November 1979. It wasn't special because a celebrity cried on television. Famous people cry all the time now. It's practically required. It wasn't even special because Johnny Carson met a passing child. Celebrities do that too. Photo ops, good publicity, warm feelings. No. What made November 2nd, 1979 special was that a 6-year-old boy taught Johnny Carson, and eventually all of us, what real courage actually means. Here's the truth Danny taught us. We live in a world that celebrates strength, that demands we keep fighting, that tells us giving up is weakness and quitting is failure. We measure courage by how long someone battles, how hard they push, how much pain they endure without complaint. But Danny Mitchell showed us something different. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you're tired. Sometimes, courage isn't about being strong. It's about being honest. Danny didn't come to The Tonight Show to be inspired or rescued. He came to give Johnny Carson, and through Johnny, all of us permission to be human. Permission to stop pretending. Remember that moment in the hospital when Johnny described the ocean? When he painted waves in salt air for a boy who'd never see the real thing? That wasn't charity. That was 2 humans being real with each other. No masks, no performance, just presence. That's real courage. Not the performance of strength, but the honesty of struggle. Johnny walked away from that night knowing he'd met someone who would change him forever. Not because Danny was brave in the way we usually define it, but because Danny was brave enough to tell the truth. I'm ready now. 3 words that shattered everything Johnny thought he knew about courage and rebuilt it into something that actually matters. And Johnny spent the next 26 years proving he'd learned the lesson. Anonymous donations. A foundation that helped thousands of children. A quieter, more honest way of living. Johnny honored the boy who taught him what courage really means, not with words, but with action. That's why this story matters. Not because it's about Johnny Carson, not because it happened on television, but because somewhere right now, Someone is pretending to be okay when they're breaking inside. Someone is being brave when all they want is permission to be tired. Maybe that someone is you. Maybe it's someone you love. If this story reminded you what really matters, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold moments that prove the most important people aren't always the famous ones. Drop a comment about someone who taught you what real courage looks like, and share this with anyone who needs to hear that being tired, being honest, being human, that's not weakness. That's courage. Ring that notification bell because these stories change us in ways we never forget.